Thank you. Salam alaikum. I'm glad to be here. I had never been at MAS-ICNA before. I've been at ICNA MAS lots of times, and it's nice to be here. I got involved in these cases back in 2004 and 2006 when I got involved in the case of a man from Albany, New York, a refugee, a Kurdish man from Iraq named Yaqeen, who was unfairly entrapped in a sting operation. And the case really opened my eyes to what was going on with Muslims being targeted post 9/11. I don't have time to talk about that case. I may mention it a little bit as it comes up. But after that case, I came to realize that Yaqeen was completely innocent, and his co-defendant. His co-defendant was only targeted to get to Yaqeen in a sting operation. Yaqeen was targeted based on false identity. And I learned that they were both completely innocent, and I started researching other cases thinking that this was just an aberration, that there weren't other cases like this, and I learned that I was very wrong, that there were many other cases that were very unfair, and I've been involved ever since. We started looking into other cases in 2007. We formed Project Salam in 2008. And then we formed the Coalition for Civil Freedoms in 2010 when we got together with other groups that were doing similar work. And we started studying all the cases that the US government they call them foreign terrorism cases, and they're all Muslims. There's so many non-Muslim people that engage in acts of what is really terrorism, and they don't call those terrorism cases, as Dr. Bukhari said. There were originally about 400 cases that between 2001 and 2010 that the US government called foreign terrorism cases. They were all prosecuted here, and they were all convicted. And then we came out with our first report talking about that in 2014. We updated it with the list of government cases going up through 2015. And there's 608 cases on that list. We studied all of them. We analyzed all of them. And we have statistics if you get our report, which is available online at Coalition for Civil Freedoms website. And we were very happy to partner with Dr. Bukhari and ICNA Council for Social Justice. I believe it's available on their website as well. We have a few copies here. We ran statistics on these cases, and we discovered that 70% of the cases, nobody had even committed a crime. So, and I should explain a little bit about how we analyzed the cases. So we found that what happened post 9/11, and the FBI will say this too, is that their main goal, understandably, was to prevent another terrorist attack on US soil after 9/11, right? But the way they did that turned out to be super unfair, because they looked at it as if there was this is something that Dick Cheney said, if there was a 1% chance that somebody was going to attack us, we needed to preempt them and stop them somehow before they could get to that point, right? So that means that there's a 99% chance that person was not going to attack us, and they still would go after them. And how do they do that? I'll talk about that. So 70% of that 608 cases were what we call pure preemptive prosecution, where the person wasn't committing any crime, really, and they weren't doing anything wrong, they weren't hurting anybody, they weren't trying to hurt anybody. They were targeted by the FBI and charged in an unfair sting operation where government informants would push them, sometimes offer them lots of money. Sometimes they would target mentally ill people and get them to say bad things and get them to agree to things that were fake, that weren't really going to happen. So there was a lot of cases like that. And then another 23% of the cases were what we call elements of preemptive prosecution, where the people may have been committing some criminal acts, but it wasn't terrorism. They may have been involved in some kind of fraud or drug cases, but because they were Muslim, it got treated as a terrorism case, either by, again, a sting operation where the government would approach them with an informant and say, I'm from this terrorist group, can we work with you on selling these drugs and we can get some of the money, things like that. They would turn them into terrorism cases. And if you add up the pure preemptive, that's 70%, and the elements, 23%, you get 93% of those 608 cases were not really terrorism cases. They were pushed into becoming terrorism cases by the FBI. There were only, out of the 608 cases, there were only 15 cases where people were actually engaging in acts of violence in the US, such as the Boston Marathon bombing, a few other cases where people actually committed violent acts or even were trying to do so without a government informant. They're very few, so only 15 out of 608. People assume that they see there's 608 terrorists prosecuted and convicted in this country, Muslim terrorists, and oh, they're starting to get released from prison, and oh, that's terrifying, but they don't realize that 93% of those, and all but 15 really, were not actually committing violent acts, unless you count the informant pushing them, and then it's fake anyway. So how do they do these sting operations? There's a few examples I'll talk about. And I should also say, this sting operation model, unfortunately, it's been so successful to the FBI's perspective that they increased the number from our first report to this report. It went up from 33% of the cases to almost 40% of the cases. They found something that worked for them, and they just keep doing it, even though you'd think maybe there's less of a threat, or they're gonna realize that there's been some unfairness, and maybe they tailored it a little bit more over the years, but there's still a lot of mentally ill people being targeted in sting operations, a lot of really unfairly long sentences happening today. And one of the cases that I'm going to mention is called the Newburgh 4 case. I don't know if you've heard of it. That was one of the most outrageous examples. There were these 4 guys, that had been in prison. They weren't even really Muslim. They had somewhat converted while they were in prison because it was easier to get along in prison if they identified as Muslim, but they weren't really practicing, and they were still using drugs. They didn't really know anything about Islam. And they ended up being brought into this just because the government wanted another case, and just because they sent an informant named Shahed Hussein, and he's the same informant that entrapped Yaqeen Arif in my case, so I was following him. I was putting out his picture. They still used him again, and they sent him to a mosque in Newburgh, New York, a small impoverished community, and he was hanging out in the mosque there for quite a while trying to get targets, and nobody was interested. In fact, he got kicked out of the mosque. People said, this guy is strange. He's talking about things we don't want to hear about. We don't want him here. He was hanging out in the parking lot of the mosque. And he got to talking one day with a man named James Cromedy, who was one of these 4 guys who had gotten out of prison and was basically a con artist, a low-level con artist. And they were trying to con each other in the parking lot, where Shahed Hussein was talking about how rich he was and how he could help James if James was interested in doing a plot with him. And James said, I'm a terrorist. Yeah, I've done all sorts of stuff. He hadn't done anything like that. He just made it up, right? Because he was trying to get money. And he got offered a lot of money. At one point, when he was, they started talking about, we're going to do this or that. And actually, it was Shahed Hussein who came up with the entire plan from the FBI. James didn't contribute anything to it. James couldn't even go on the internet and look at maps. He couldn't figure that out. So the whole plot came from the FBI. And at one point, James got sick of it because he wasn't getting, lots of money. He was getting some money. He was being offered lots of stuff, but he got sick of it. And he didn't talk to Shahed Hussein for a long time. Then finally, Shahed Hussein gets him on the phone and says, brother, I promised you $250,000, but I guess you don't want it. James said, I'm in. So he came back in, and the FBI said he wasn't supposed to promise him that, but he did. And then they got 3 other guys who were even more down and out than James at the end. One of them was schizophrenic. None of them had a driver's license or a car or even a job, maybe a little bit of part-time. And they were promised $5,000 each. They only did it for the money. And you can find a lot of people in communities like Newburgh to do things like that for $5,000, and especially for $250,000. They didn't even have any ideology, they didn't want to do anything like this. They were just purely doing it for the money. And the judge realized that, but the jury convicted them of attempted use of weapons of mass destruction, which was their cell phone that was supposedly connected to bombs, but they didn't even wire them right, whether because they didn't know how or because they didn't really want to do it, who knows. But they got sentenced to 25 years each. And there's other cases like that where people got life sentences. And there's a case in Florida where a man got a life sentence, Harlem Suarez, who was mentally ill. He was entrapped into a sting operation by the FBI, and similar kind of thing, but it was just him, and he got a life sentence. There's a couple cases in Chicago of mentally ill young men who were entrapped by the FBI, Adel Daoud and Sami Hassoun. I was just reading about that case. Adel Daoud got 16 years. He was lucky. He got a much lower sentence than many people. Sami Hassoun got 23 years. And these are people who wouldn't have done anything if the informant hadn't been pushing them and figuring out how to get them interested, showing them videos of atrocities, offering them money, acting like a older brother, advising them that this is proper in Islam. Even in one of the cases, the man went to his imam and said, "Oh, my imam says this is wrong, this is haram." And the informant said, "Oh, I have a different imam for you to talk to," which was an undercover agent who told him it was okay. It was, so that's the kind of thing they do. One of the other tools that the FBI uses is the material support to terrorism law, and that only applies basically to Muslims and other foreign, where they get people they pretend that people are connected to a foreign terrorist organization. In other words, in many of the sting operations, the informant will say they're with JEM or Al-Qaeda or ISIS or these groups that are on the designated foreign terrorist list. And really, in most of the cases, the targets don't have any actual contact with these groups. But because the informant says they're with the group, they're allowed to, the government says they can be charged with material support to this terrorist organization. And there's also some cases where there weren't informants involved that are still really unfair, where people are charged with material support for trying to help people. And the most famous case of that is the Holy Land Foundation. It was the biggest Muslim charity in the US. Wonderful people running it, and they were giving aid to all sorts of needy people around the world, including in Gaza. So they were giving money to zakat committees in Gaza, which are the same committees that the U.S. Agency for International Development was giving money to, and the International Red Cross. But because this was a Muslim organization doing that, and they were Palestinian, they got targeted and they got charged with material support. It was argued that the zakat committees were somehow controlled by Hamas, which they weren't really, but Hamas was certainly present in Gaza. Later, they became the elected government of Gaza. And there was a mistrial first, and then they got convicted in the second trial, and they got sentenced to 65 years. And that's basically a life sentence for these guys who are actually the most wonderful humanitarian people you could ever meet. We're in touch with their families and them, and it's heartbreaking. One of the other tools that the government uses to convict people unfairly is classified evidence. And that was something that weighed very heavily in Yaqeen Arif's case. They filed under the Classified Information Procedures Act, which allowed them to give all sorts of secret evidence to the judge. And my boss at the time, Terry Kinlan, got a security clearance just to see this evidence, because under the Sixth Amendment, you're supposed to be able to confront the evidence against you. And he got the security clearance, but he didn't get to see any of the evidence. Why? It turns out that the legal standard is that the evidence has to be, quote, favorable to the defense. to be provided to the defense attorney. So what happened, we found out years later, was that the government thought Yaqeen was somebody else who was an Al-Qaeda member named Mohammed Yaqeen. And they were giving evidence to the judge saying, this is really a bad guy named Mohammed Yaqeen. He's an Al-Qaeda operative. He's very slippery, etc. And the judge believed it. The judge didn't give it to us because it wasn't favorable, right? But if we had been able to investigate that, we could have easily shown it was false. This guy was missing fingers. He wasn't Kurdish like Yaqeen. He died in 2010. I mean, it would have been really easy to show that that was false. But we didn't get to do that because there was this huge Sixth Amendment violation, which has unfortunately been upheld by the courts in these kinds of cases. So that's used in a lot of cases to get unfairly prejudicial evidence to the judge, and then the judge makes rulings against the defendant, even if it's not given to the jury. So in our case, in Yaqeen's case, the judge told the jury that the government had good and valid reasons for targeting Yaqeen. So then they're looking at the evidence in the sting operation, and Yaqeen never even said anything bad, which usually is the case in sting operations. Usually the person says something bad. He didn't even do that. He didn't even know there was anything illegal going on. It was just a loan that he was witnessing. I don't have time to go into it, but there was no evidence. And yet the jury was told this was a bad guy. They had good reasons for going after him. And so they were afraid to acquit him. They acquitted him of most of the counts, but then they convicted him of a few counts, which was enough for him to get 15 years. And he's now served that sentence. We tried through all these years to get him out and lost every step of the way. But he's out now. He got deported last June to Kurdistan, to the Kurdish area of Iraq, and he's doing great, and his family is doing great, unlike many of the cases where the families really suffer. The community in Albany, New York really rallied around Yaqeen and his family and the co-defendant and his family. So how much time do I have? Not much, huh? What? Okay. Okay. There's as I said, some of the cases got life sentences, and I just wanted to mention a couple of them. Ahmed Abu Ali got life sentence based on a tortured confession in Saudi custody when he was studying there, and he got arrested at the behest of the U.S. and was tortured, and they got a confession. Then he was brought back to the U.S. and charged based on that false confession. And the defense tried to say, look, this is tortured. You can't allow this. But the judge said, no, I don't think it was tortured. And so he got a life sentence. The Fort Dix Five is a case of 3 brothers and 2 other men, the 3 Duca brothers and Mohammed Shnur and Sedar Tatar. And the 3 Duca brothers and Mohammed Shnur got sentenced to life in a ridiculously unfair sting operation. They actually got sentenced to life plus 30 years. All the Duca brothers wanted to do was buy guns so that they could go to they went to shooting ranges, weren't doing anything illegal, but they weren't allowed to legally possess guns because they didn't have legal status in the U.S. They had come as young children from Albania. And so they were somehow connected to this other plot that was supposedly going to attack Fort Dix, but it ended up being so vague. They weren't convicted of trying to attack Fort Dix. They were convicted under this charge called conspiracy to murder abroad, to murder unknown people in an unknown place at an unknown time, because there was no real plot. There was just the informant talking about conspiracy and showing them videos and them saying, oh, maybe not, trying to acting a little macho sometimes, but nothing specific. They weren't trying to do anything. They even said, like, we have our families here. 2 of them were married with children, and they got sentenced to life. And now I've been brought in, myself and Steve Downs, the co-author of our report, we've been brought in to represent them. Their case is coming back because the extra 30 years is now probably unconstitutional under a Supreme Court case based on the definition of crime of violence. It's kind of complicated, but we should be able to get rid of the extra 30 years, but then they still have the life sentence. We're going to try to go after the life sentence in this proceeding coming up too, but it's doubtful because the judge really doesn't like them based on whatever classified evidence he saw. And they're good people. They weren't trying to do anything bad. So what are we going to do about all this? So, well, there are some hopeful trends over the last few years. There's some people that have gotten out based on the new Supreme Court case. There's Masood Khan and Saifullah Chapman. They were part of this Virginia paintball case that was a really unfair early case. They had life sentences based on this definition of crime of violence that the Supreme Court has now said is unconstitutional. So they were actually released last summer. So that was, I think, the summer before, actually. So that was good. And there's Hamid Hayat got out. He got a new trial, and I don't even think they're going to retry him because that was a case where it was a sting operation and a false confession. And they managed to prove that in a post-conviction case, which is very rare. But there's still so much unfairness going on with the entrapment and the material support and the classified evidence and also the super long sentences. So what we're proposing is a bill which we've drafted last year. We drafted a bill and we call it the EGO bill, the Entrapment and Governmental Overreach Act. And it would do three things. One is it would provide for an entrapment defense. Now people say, oh, there is an entrapment defense. Well, if you can have a case like the Newburgh case where clearly they were entrapped, and there's no entrapment defense because the judge tells the jury that if the people are offered $250,000 but they don't back out of the plot, then that's not entrapment because it shows they were predisposed by not backing out. That's not an entrapment defense. So we're trying to create an actual entrapment defense in the law that says, like in most places this is illegal. In England and lots of other places this is illegal. But our entrapment defense would say, if the people targeted weren't already trying to do something, taking steps, not just saying something on the internet that isn't specific, if they weren't actually trying to do something before the informant starts pushing them and manipulating them and offering them money, then they can't be convicted in this sting operation. So that's a big part of it. And the other part is material support. You can't be convicted of material support without evidence that you were trying to support violence. Because right now, you don't need to show a support for violence. You just have to show some kind of support for a group on the list. And it could be something like trying to convince the group on the terrorism list not to engage in violence. That even counts as material support to terrorism. So we want to change that. And then the third part in the bill would be that if there's classified evidence that's given to the judge, then it also has to be given to the defense attorney with a security clearance. That seems like a no-brainer, and yet that's not how it is now. So we want to get those three things passed, and we want to make it retroactive so we can go back and try to get our people out, the people we've been fighting for all these years. And so we've been starting to lobby on this, but we need a sponsor right now. A lot of people have shown interest. A lot of the legislators have said, yeah, this sounds good, I'll support it, but I'm not going to sponsor it. So we need somebody willing to stick their neck out and be a sponsor, and then we can really push for it. So that's what we're working on now. And we also have family conferences every year with the family members, and the last one was really awesome, and James Yee, who's here, came, and that was great. And a lot of people, it's been growing. And we also give Ramadan gifts to the prisoners who are unfairly sentenced. So we're hoping that we can get this bill passed and really make a difference. And we're hoping that you all will educate people about these issues too. Thank you.